This is actually for Gabriel. You said you started the book because you wanted to explore the idea of like being a victim and survival and a more understanding. So I have two questions for you. Was there a character in mind when you started? I mean, was Turtle an idea? I mean, how did you kind of go from the idea of what you wanted to do to the actual doing? And the book is dark, and I just wondered what it was like to be in that world for however long it took you to write it.
Yeah. I love those questions. So I actually started out with a much brainier book. I'm really interested in the idea of global warming, and I wanted to write a novel that was sort of a big idea-driven, multi-character epic about this problem where we destroy things that we love because we cannot tolerate their independence from us. Right? Like I was very interested in, I wanted to write like sort of an environmental epic. And in this environmental epic, I had the turtle of character. I had the character of Turtle, loved her. She was an important part of the book. But her story was immediately more pressing than everything else. And I at a certain point, I decided that it was wrong to have Turtle, whose story was urgent, be a side character in a book dominated by brainy men thinking about environmental problems. And so it seemed that the only right thing to do was to pare everything else out and give her the luxury of the novel's full attention. So that's how I arrived at that character. And it was a terrifying choice. Like when I realized this, I called my mom. I was like, I'm out. Like it's gonna take like years to write this book. I don't know that I have the courage. It seems insane. I have like right now a book that is publishable, and I just like I can't morally do it. I like I'm gonna end up writing an entirely different book. And she was like, no, if you don't do it, you'll always regret it. So that's how I launched into that, and that's how it became the story that it is, a serious exploration of abuse and survival. And then how was it to spend that much time in a dark place? It was hard, but I have friends who I know people who came up hard, and not all of them lived to see adulthood, and I felt that if I told lies about that, if I made things seem easier, it would be disrespectful. It would be like saying your life has become so hard that it cannot be narrated, it can only be elided. Like you aren't fit to be the protagonist of a book. Because of what has happened to you, you've been rendered into a peripheral character. I couldn't do that, and I knew people like to me the awfulness of what some people go through is characterized by the fact that they cannot draw a curtain on their own lives, right? Like this, we are all stuck in our own lives and have to live them moment to moment and can't escape. And I feel like if everyone knew that, we would not tolerate the things that we tolerate. And so I wanted to show the relentlessness of surviving and kind of give a dignity to the young woman who survives those things. So that's why I took that approach, and it was hard, and I took solace in drink.
Lisa? I really enjoyed your book, and I think you did an excellent job in terms of getting the reader to feel a lot of emotion for the characters. And I especially appreciated Deming's friend from childhood, because I felt like the world was so against Deming in so many paths that he took, and that friend was such an anchor throughout those difficulties. So thank you for him.
Thank you.
Gabriel, I read your book this summer. I had a hard time reading it because it's a very painful book to read. Your writing is incredible, so I honestly couldn't put it down. But I have two questions for you. One I think you partially answered is I couldn't imagine you coming up with the almost torture that Turtle went through in her life and how she kept her strength up, which I really admired. So I don't know how you could do that. The other thing is she was incredible living in the outdoors, how she survived. And I wondered, did you actually experience that yourself? Because you, if so, you are a true outdoorsman.
Yes. So I as a child, like Turtle's experience of the outdoors is my young life. I spent a tremendous amount of time out in the outdoors. I went on frequent backpacking trips. I often I have a terrible sense of direction, so like actually a horrible outdoorsman. because like 3 days in, I'll be like, I don't know where I am. And yeah, I had a number of experiences like that. I've been, and I was passionate about that, and I did a lot of my writing while in the backcountry. I wrote extensively while hiking the West Highland Trail. Spent a really long time doing that, and I also wrote extensively on other backpacking trips, and I worked with youth out in the backcountry. I did 5-week backcountry trail projects with young people, and so I wanted to put the love of place, my love of place, in the book. That was important and urgent for me, and that I feel like ethically that is important because we are losing the language with which we understand and apprehend the natural world, and this is so close to my heart that I wanted to put those things in a book and show how we can take solace from that. And then the other part of your question was like how I came up with this character, like. So I am very close to a number of my close friends growing up went through hell, and I lived with them through it and talked with them through it, and viewed it from a gap of privilege, right? Like thinking and but you have friends in your life who sit across the table of gender from you, and you see them live through things. And I think that if you're a man and you have enough women friends, you know people who go through violence. And so I observed those things across the table of gender, but it felt important to write about them seriously. And I felt that because I'd seen, I mean, this is an awful thing to say, but I'd seen enough instances of violence that I could make violence up, right? Like I wanted to take the true things that I had seen and put them in fictional characters and fictional events. While still getting at the truth of the important truths that I had witnessed. And I had an objective, which is I felt that if more parts of this story were more widely known, there are things that would have kept people alive. Like some people die from the shame because they think that they're the only one.
I also for Gabriel, and it's on the same idea of this scene, and I don't want to mention the scene, so in case people haven't read the book, but I found that it, as much as I believe in the whole idea that you came up with, the child is enthralled by the parent, no matter what the parent does. I lost a little bit of my credibility after that one scene that was so unbelievable that afterwards she didn't immediately run away. It was beyond violent, and I think you know what I'm talking about, right? Which scene?
No,
I don't want to mention it because maybe
sure,
people want to.
Okay, but the essential issue is why doesn't someone behave in a better way? And
well, not exactly. I understand why she behaves that way. Only that scene was. It was beyond the pale to me. I almost lost credibility and couldn't continue reading, but I did, and that's to your good writing.
Well, thank you. I think that is an important question that gets really thorny, and I would say that gets to the heart of Turtle's personal sense of shame, right? Like Turtle feels that it is a profound failing of hers that she's unable to extract herself from this situation when obviously she should, in the first pages. The issue isn't her technical inability to escape. The issue is that she is lost and does the wrong thing and is ashamed for having done the wrong thing. And I think some of us, when we find ourselves doing the shameful and wrong and self-destructive thing, somehow it becomes difficult to extract yourself from that, because you begin to think in this affirming way, like, I'm just the sort of person who does the wrong thing. I'm just a useless person. I'm the sort of person who can't extract myself from these situations. That's why I'm a bad survivor, and there are good survivors who do the right thing, and I've done the wrong thing, and now I can't do the right thing because I'm just this sort of worthless person who's, like, when you lose that sense of self-worth, it becomes very difficult to extract yourself. And I wanted to pay homage and to be respectful of that, because I think that is a thing that people who have gone through have real trouble talking about, and because I think that other people have written very well about survivors who behave better. And this is just the story that I wanted to tell. But I'm with you, I wish she had just right in the beginning, just left. Could have been a much shorter, happier book.
Any other questions?
I haven't listened to mine. Thanks.
Whoever reads The Changeling is sexy. I mean, that is a good audiobook.
I read that book. So I think it's great.
I haven't listened to mine. I heard several actresses read and chose the one with the California accent. Well, I don't know if I was able to choose or they just gave me the illusion of choice. But they what?
I had no input. I just received a stack of CDs in the mail. But I don't have a CD player anymore, so I can't listen to them.
They didn't send an MP3 even or something?
No, just like 8 CDs.
I
They don't make
auditioned
CDs
for mine.
anymore.
Yeah. They were going to hire some actors, but I said I think I would like to audition, and I think I could do a better job. And
He just barely beat out Morgan Freeman.
that's it. But he doesn't have a Queen's accent, so the Queen's accent won. That's it.
Okay. I have a question for you guys, and then I'll pass the mic that way. I want to know, at what point in writing your book do you decide whether a parent's lesson are going to have a positive influence on your character or not? Whereas in Lisa's story, where the parent left and it was of no choice of their own, so the stories that they told their child had a positive influence, or in like Gabriel's, where Turtle has a father who lectures her and then it has a negative influence on her. I want to know, at one point do you guys differentiate how that's going to impact the character?
I feel like the loss of Deming's mother is almost as meaningful as her presence in a way. It's kind of like how you often don't necessarily appreciate people until they're gone. And like, because of her disappearance, she ends up becoming like larger than life to him. And also representative of so many things, right? It's not only that she's gone, but that he's lost his connection to his culture, his home city, and with the loss of Polly comes like the loss of so many other things for him.
And at least in mine, I would say it's never just positive or negative, right? Like that. In fact, there are times when so Apollo has a recurring dream about his father that's sort of a nightmare, and one of the questions is the nightmare something that he just made up, or is it actually something that happened that he's sort of like filtered in a strange way? But there's still even something loving in that. I mean, I think sometimes the thing that is when people talk about parenting, the idea that parenting is a net positive, like that parenting is a negative effect or a positive effect, is really almost literally like the day that you see the parenting happen. The tired day, even a great parent seems like a lousy parent, or can. And the best day, even a terrible parent has some good days where they just do right by their kids, you know. And I think sometimes the confusing, when you were talking about the scene that was a bridge too far or something like that, I was thinking of this poem by a great poet named Van Jordan, and the poem is from the point of view of a child, like an infant who is killed by his mother, right? And he's in the afterlife, and the whole poem is him lobbying for his mother, who's on her deathbed, to be accepted into heaven. Because even though and the poem is laying out, I know she did this to me. I know she did this to me. I know she neglected me. I know she killed me. But I still want her to be safe. She's still my mother. You know, and it's really like a mind-blowing poem because it gets at that idea that even this terrible being, or even a quote-unquote terrible being, is not terrible all the time. You know, and the idea that, and that can be troubling, I think, sometimes to folks, to think that, because then maybe sometimes you think of yourself and think, no, I'm a good parent, and I am a good parent, but even still, like one of the running jokes in our family with my two kids, they're 6 and 4, is I say, Dad's never grumpy, right? And then my two kids just laugh like for 2 minutes. I say, and then we just go, all right, let's get on with things. You know, so I think it's both. Yeah.
I wanted to ask you all if you are working on something else, and also how much time do you spend in rewriting, or are you like all kind of lucky and able to kind of get it down, or is it like a lot of recrafting? I know, Lisa, you had mentioned kind of throwing away different drafts or different, so like what is the process, and are you able to now move into new projects?
I rewrite extensively. I write very quickly, and I generally spend long days. I write for like 6 and 12 hours at a day, and write between 20 and 30 pages, and then for me the huge bulk of it is rewriting, often beginning from the blank page and sort of holding the last draft in my mind as kind of the ideal of what it could be. So for me, it's a huge amount of rewriting. It all occurs there. I was a server while I wrote this book. I don't currently have a day job. I will probably be a server again.
So I teach, and then like I said, we have the 2 kids. So once our son was born, the way it went was my wife had our son on May 21st, 2011, and she said we're both college professors, and so we had a couple months off in the summer, and what she said was, I need a little time to get out of the house every day, or else I'm gonna go mad in these first few weeks. So I need 2 hours out of the house. And so I'll give you 2 hours out of the house. And what that meant was I had to go to the Dunkin' Donuts around the corner. We live in Manhattan. I found a Dunkin' Donuts around the corner. Across the street was the Port Authority bus station where I could use the bathroom. So it was a good spot. And I could get out my 2 hours and spend most of that 2 hours actually writing. And then I would go and relieve her, and we would do that. But what I discovered was by doing 2 hours a day, at this point now, like 3 days a week, let's say, I was more productive than I ever was before we had kids, and before before life sort of became more hectic. And so now it's just a routine, 10 to 12, 3 days a week. I sit down, I write, and in that time, my mind is just ready. It produces, it stops, and now I know for the rest of the day, take care of the kids, go to work, whatever it is, I did the job, I did the time. And at least for me, who I thrive on a degree of regimentation, I really need that. It's a great method for me, and I'm happy not to go back, even when they leave the house. And I'm working on a novella, kind of a Western set in Montana, about homesteading women. Used to be you could homestead in Montana as a woman on your own. You did not need a man to co-sign with you, and I was very interested in that. And so it's a novella about a woman and her sister who go to homestead there and go to war with the U.S. cavalry.
I am, yeah. I'm writing a novel that is about depression secondary to traumatic brain injury in a professional climber. And so it is a lot about recovery from a serious life-destroying accident, and it is about climbing towers, sandstone towers in the Southwest.
Let's see. I'm vaguely trying to start writing something else. That's going to be very different than this, but it's been hard. I feel like I've been doing a lot of events and traveling for the Leavers, so I haven't gotten to the point yet where I'm able to successfully kind of concentrate full on a new project while still kind of having to think and talk about this one so much. I'm very envious of people who figured out how to do that, but haven't gotten there yet. And yeah, for me, I mean, I usually write in the mornings. I had a full-time like office drone job while working on this, and I would just try to get it out of the way, like treat it like going to the gym, like those 2 hours that you mentioned, Victor. And yeah, I mean, rewriting is writing for me. Like that's it, right? So a lot of it is just trying to figure out like how to best tell the story in whatever way that is. I feel like everyone's got their own process. For me, like I overwrite a lot of crap and I delete most of it. Other people like spend hours working, churning out like one perfect sentence. I've never been that person. So a lot of it is just like produce, then like delete.
Many years ago, I used to work as a primary therapist with sexually and physically abused children. And the one thing I could not, and has to do with my very fortunate growing up, is I could never wrap my mind around the fact that no matter how poorly that parent treated them, raped them, you name it, it was like they couldn't let go of that parent. It was like one parent was better than none. Mm-hmm. And I'm picking up some of that same in what you're all saying. I'm still puzzled by these children, and I wasn't able to find any good explanation for it in my own mind.
Well, I'll tell a story, so when I remember, this is a story that was my mother related to me. That this was not a story that I certainly remembered. But my mom, she came here, she met my dad, had me, but they quickly divorced before I was 1 year old. And then my grandmother had not emigrated from Uganda yet, so my mom was on her own and was really having a pretty hard time. And so when I was 3, I remember she went to her job with me, and she went to whatever floor it was, and she climbed out onto the ledge and was going to jump with the two of us, And her thinking was, if I don't take him with me, who am I going to be leaving him to, right? And the idea that and I think it's a very fair idea, is like, whatever a parent has done to you, nobody's going to care. No one has a closer association with you, certainly, than them. So no matter how bad they are, the world is probably worse, right? And so why would you trust the world if your parent, why would you trust the world more than your parents? So all this is to say, so the way my mom knew that she had finally taken it too far was, so she was out there for a little while. People called the cops. They came, things like that. And then she was pulled in by the cops, and she was still like just intent on doing this. And then she said, as they were pulling her down, I ran and I started kicking the cops, and I said, "Take your hands off my mommy. Take your hands off my mommy." And that was the moment for her, she said, when she was lying there, when she realized, like, almost like her vision had readjusted, and she said, "What did I almost just do?" Do you know? But it was because she had just gone to a place beyond, she had been pushed to a place beyond where she was thinking rationally or doing things based on any real conscious decisions. It was instinct. But when I was jumping on like yelling at the cops, that was also instinct. Do you know? And I feel like at the heart of at least that situation, and perhaps at the heart of some of these situations, is the idea that this stuff is so deeply hardwired, you can't unteach that, and you can't unlearn that. And that unfortunately there are then, obviously, like my mom ended up being a wonderful parent, all this kind of stuff. She got some help and she was great. But unfortunately then there will be adults who can take advantage of that degree of instinct. But to my mind, I feel like it's like lizard brain level sort of thinking, and it can't be undone. It can maybe only be mitigated.
I think there's a way in which when a child has a parent who is not well, the child can never surrender the dream that the parent will recover, which is like a way that a lot of us have felt about addicts in our life, because you know who the addict is at their best, right? And you hold out hope because they always could recover. And when you have a wounded person in your life and a wounded parent, I think a lot of times you hold in your heart the dream of who that parent is at their best, and the knowledge of what their love is like at its best, and you hold on to that. And it's very hard to ever surrender that, because it's very hard to ever call quits on a person. Right, that's so serious, and people are so dynamic, and children always hold the hope. They always carry the torch that the parent will be better than their more wounded self. Which, like, if you think about it, it's not like a terrible, like, there's something great about that. It's like the hope we have in humanity.
Despite all evidence. Yes.
Yeah, and also the role that memory plays in that too. If a parent has left, and the kind of going back to the idea of storytelling and how with the stories that we tell ourselves and kind of retell history. I know for my character, that's something that his memory of how good things were might not have been as good as, or might have been an embellished version of how they really were, but becomes sort of, that memory kind of surpasses the truth in its own way.
Are there any more questions before we? Any more questions? No?
Well, thank you all for coming out.
Oh, thank you. FYI, their books, the author's books will be sold downstairs if anybody's interested. And thank you so much for coming. Have a good rest of the day. Thank you.
I feel like, I don't know how they will feel. I enjoyed the conversation.
Yeah, it was good. Yeah.
No. Yeah, yeah.
And what's interesting is that it's true, the horrors that some of these kids have gone through.
Yeah.
It defies
Yeah.
description. They still have this hope.
Yeah.
But what's interesting is I have an
foster parent is adopting her. We asked her the other day, what would you like? If you had a choice, would you like to go back to your mom or stay with your foster mom? And she said, I'd rather stay with my foster mom because I know she's going to take care of me. And that was really amazing because that had been one of the first times that a child
Had said
I'm a
that.
social worker.
Yeah.
And that a child had ever not sagged with the mom.
Sure.
You know, and in a way, I wanted to say, good for you. Good for you.
Yeah.
Because you will get better care with this
Sure.
mom who's going to adopt her.
Yeah.
Than she did with her.
With her own. Yeah.
So I was thinking about all what you were talking about, you
Yeah.
know, and I was kind of happy that she went the other way.
Right. Sure. Sure. For sure.
Because I was scared. I was scared.
Yeah. Well, I hope it all
For
works.
bringing these things up, and
And thanks for doing that.
she's going to take you down to the
Okay.
table where your books are.
And then the next presentation is you can make the announcement that the authors are here to autograph books as well.
Absolutely.
Because I don't know if everybody's familiar. So it's just at the red autographing area that's downstairs to the left.
Okay.
That's what I'm just coming to tell you.
good afternoon, everybody. You can all hear me? Everybody's good? Okay. Well, first of all, welcome to Miami-Dade College. My name is Merle Wexler. I'm a volunteer, and I'm also an instructor on several of the campuses here. So I'm not going to spend time telling you about Malcolm's credits, because I think you're all here because you know about him. Am I right? Okay, fine. Okay, so I'd rather give him more time to talk and me less time to talk. Is that all right? You're good. Okay, so he's going to talk. And then about 30 minutes, 35 minutes after, we'll open it up to question and answers. And a reminder, after the presentation, there is a book signing downstairs. And thank you very much for being here. Thank you. And here is Malcolm.
I'm going to set a timer because I can talk forever. I mean, I thought 30 minutes. Yeah, she'll be my timer. Good. So, the funny thing is, I just did an interview for 30 minutes upstairs with Fernanda Monde. And so I haven't given this a lot of thought. But I have been speaking about this subject for about 16 months nonstop. So if any of you know anything about the book, The Plot to Hack America, you'll know that the first time that I referenced anything with relation to the Russian hackings was on 23 July of 2016. And for about 2 days, and this is how the book actually came about, for about 2 days, I had been in NBC studios. We were in Philadelphia. They were preparing to go into the Democratic National Convention. And I was seeing all of these indications that the information that was coming out in WikiLeaks, which was about to come out in WikiLeaks, just had a pattern that was very familiar to me. And for about 5 months prior to July, I had been writing a book with Chris Sampson, who's down front here, my co-author, of another book called Hacking ISIS. And we had been collecting all of this data of how ISIS had been using social media, they had been using hacking and all of these hacking tools to carry out these attacks. But as we developed this book, we realized there were 2 attacks that were attributed to ISIS, which were not actually ISIS. And one of the attacks, the most significant, was against TV5 in Paris, TV5 in Paris. And this attack, once it was analyzed by the French, was carried out by an entity called ATP-28, Advanced Persistent Threat number 28. And that had the name of Fancy Bear. That's what the company CrowdStrike, the cybersecurity company, nicknamed it, Fancy Bear. And its sister malware suite, by the way, the name Fancy Bear is not a group of people. It is an actual suite of malware that is used to penetrate into servers, steal your information, and transmit it back to the servers of Russian intelligence. So ATP-28 and its sister suite, ATP-29, Cozy Bear, were the types of malware that were being used. So while we were writing this book, we were like, wow, that's very interesting. Why would the Russians pretend to be ISIS? So we started looking into it much deeper. And we found out that Advanced Persistent Threat 28 and 29 were not only used in this malware attack against ISIS, it was used in an attack against the Pentagon, an attack against the White House, an attack against the British Parliament, an attack against Germany's Parliament. Most interestingly, it was used in an attack on 2 Ukrainian power plants, where they entered into the servers, seized control of the technical controls of these power plants, and then using people in Russia who were actually power plant operators, systematically shut down 2 power plants and cut power in eastern Ukraine to 100,000 people. So as we looked at this, we were like, whoa, wait a minute. So this is what these Russian malware suites are doing, you know. Why are they trying to mimic that they're ISIS? And so we generally call that in the intelligence community a false flag attack. And I don't really you know, when I find people who reference false flag attacks, it's always to say something like Newtown was all fake or the 9/11 attacks were carried out by, you know, Martians or somebody. So we usually rarely see real false flag attacks. But the Russians' use of this malware suite to pretend that they were ISIS in order to influence French television by stealing materials, accesses, and control of their systems so that Russian intelligence could use them for their own nefarious purposes. That caught our attention, and I didn't think anything else about it, all right? Wrote it down, put a section of the book, didn't think anything about it. Until March, when we found out that the Democratic National Committee servers had been hacked. And it was interesting because there were a series of events that started to lead me to believe that there was something that was either state-sponsored and far more nefarious than even the initial report that there had been a hacking at the DNC. And these were the things that occurred in sequence. The end of March, CrowdStrike, a cybersecurity company, said that the DNC had been hacked and that it appeared that state actors may have played in there. Okay, I set that little bit of data aside. The next thing that I heard was, on April 19th, Judge Napolitano of Fox News, you guys might know this guy, right? He comes out and he's on Fox News and he says, I have it on good authority that the Kremlin was having a debate, right, between Vladimir Putin and his top senior aides and the head of Russian spy agencies, and they were debating whether they should release 20,000 of Hillary Clinton's emails. They had hacked her server, they had all of her emails, and they had gotten this out. And I heard this from some intelligence source. And in fact, I was brought on to MSNBC that day to discuss this point. And they said, well, what do you think of this report? And I said, whoa, that's impossible. This information is what we call crown jewels intelligence. To know what Vladimir Putin was saying to his top 5 cronies behind a closed door, right? That means the source is one of those 5 people, all right? You can't do that with technical intelligence. It's not like you got a bug under his water glass. This requires one of those people to betray their country to us. I don't believe this story. That story is impossible. But they had me on to talk about it anyway. And I kept saying, crown jewels intelligence. It ain't real. But you have to ask yourself this question. If it's not real, how did it get into Judge Napolitano's head? And how did he come out and say this on Fox News? So I started looking for the source of that story. While I was looking for the source of that story, a few days later, Sam Biddle at Gawker Media, back when Gawker was still around, was given and released the entire opposition research folder on Donald Trump that was in the servers of the Democratic National Committee. Just woke up one morning and it's in his inbox. All of the opposition research. The woman who was doing that research was a young woman named Alexandra Chalupa. And later on, press reporting would say that she was under constant attack. Her Yahoo account 3 to 5 times a day would have a warning saying, we believe that non-state actors are trying to access your email. All right? She didn't think a lot about that because, like most people who are users, you don't think about, oh, that's just spam, that's just, cyber stuff. What do we know about that? The point is, the Russians had already been in the servers, stolen her research, and for those of you who know the Karl Rove playbook, right? Get bad things out early. And that's what happened. Someone sent that to Gawker Media. Gawker published all the opposition research about Donald Trump, which was nothing. It wasn't anything that nobody didn't know anyway, right? It was pretty much press reports. So now we're at the end of April, the beginning of May. 30 days later, CrowdStrike, the cybersecurity company, comes out and makes their report. And they say, the Democratic National Committee has been hacked by Russian intelligence entities. And I've met Sean Henry, the FBI agent who was on CrowdStrike's board, who saw the hacking. He said, we physically saw files open up, move, get passed onto a server which we have identified as a server inside Russian military intelligence headquarters in Moscow. Now, sometimes you'll hear people say, no, it was an insider and he took a flash memory and he just copied everything. When they went back and did the data analysis of the DNC servers, the Russians had been in those servers for over a year. And they took everything. Voicemails, every digital voicemail that was left was copied. When you put in a credit card, they had access to all of that. They were taking chats that people inside the DNC were doing real time. They had copied and vacuumed everything. And as soon as I saw that report, all of the previous little coincidences that I had been watching fell into place, including my hacking that was carried out supposedly by ISIS, because CrowdStrike identified the group that had done it, or the malware suite that had done it, as Advanced Persistent Threat 28 and Advanced Persistent Threat 29, Cozy Bear and Fancy Bear. The same malware suites that had for 5 or 6 years been used in hackings all over NATO, all over Russia's enemies. So now I have definitive intelligence. All of those little coincidences were all falling into place. And it goes back, now I'm going to bring together, why did Judge Napolitano get that information about Hillary Clinton's emails? After CrowdStrike had released their report, an entity popped up on the internet calling himself Guccifer 2.0. That's what the name. And had a little website and said, hi, I'm Guccifer 2.0. I stole everything at the DNC. Which is funny because the original character Guccifer was a Romanian hacker who was currently at that time in FBI custody for hacking Colin Powell's emails and the emails of several other people. And he was a cooperating witness with the FBI. So whoever Guccifer 2.0 was someone making fun of us and using Guccifer 2.0. A lot of journalists started communicating with this entity. And some people who were in the cybersecurity world noticed a few things. Most notably, Guccifer 2.0's computer was operating at the Moscow time zone. Guccifer 2.0 kept saying that he was Romanian, like the original Guccifer, right? But wasn't able to speak Romanian very well, almost like Google Translate Romanian. When they brought, because media people from Romania were calling him. Another thing is, someone had done a digital analysis of how he used his keystrokes. You know how you use a keyboard? And they determined the keyboard was Russian Cyrillic letters, not Romanian letters. By the way, Romanian is like Italian with an Eastern European accent. And they were like, well, wait a minute. The person you're communicating with, this is clearly a Russian. And then, of course, Guccifer 2.0 sort of disappeared, but not before promising to give everything they had to WikiLeaks. A few weeks later, WikiLeaks pops up and says they have all of the DNC emails. Now, this is significant because we now know that it was Russian intelligence that was inside the DNC servers for almost a year, vacuuming up everything. And so when WikiLeaks got that information, it was very easy to see what was about to happen. They were being used, as in the intelligence community, we call them a pass-through or a cutout. But a cutout is a person or an entity that generally doesn't know they're being played. To get that information after a month's reporting that this was all Russian intelligence and that these malware suites, these code name entities had been used in hackings all over the world, WikiLeaks decided it was their obligation to put all of this information out. And it was very clear that Julian Assange did not like Hillary Clinton, didn't like her at all. He blames her for getting him into the Ecuadorian embassy. So WikiLeaks decides to release all of this information. Interestingly, they released it on the morning before the first day of the Democratic National Committee. And the documents that they released were not just, here's everything at the DNC. They were focused documents on supposedly Debbie Wasserman Schultz being in the pocket of Hillary Clinton in order to steal the election from Bernie Sanders. Now, when that happened, and the weekend before, I realized back in my long intelligence career that I'd seen an operation like this before. And I recall briefings that I had received. And this is why people say, hey, Malcolm, you're a Middle East guy. Why are you doing this Russia stuff? Well, because I started in the Cold War. And our opposition at that time was called the KGB. And from the look of most people here, you all remember the KGB. Well, you know, this is great because I got into a little fight with Glenn Greenwald online. He goes, Malcolm Nance thinks the KGB still exists. They ceased to exist 30 years ago. If I change the letters CIA to LMN, does the CIA building magically disappear? And all of their archives go off the face of the planet, and they start afresh from that? The KGB is an entity that changed its letters, and all they did was taken out the border guards from their organization and then went back to work with more money, loads more money. But this operation that I saw, I said, you know what? This looks familiar. Back when I was a little baby spy, they used to brief us quarterly on KGB operations. We had to be aware of KGB activities, political warfare activities, and most importantly, agent recruitment techniques, and how they would try to curry you as an agent. And I saw all of this stuff unfold over that weekend, and I said, that explains everything. It explains way back all of our research, why these Russian intelligence entities were doing it, and it was very clear they had one goal, and that was to execute Watergate perfectly. They didn't have to hire 6 ex-CIA guys and Bay of Pigs guys to break into the Watergate physically. They just executed Watergate perfectly. They went into the DNC, and in 1973, they got caught planting bugs and going through files. This time, they just stole everything for a year and then came out themselves and gave that information to the US media. And in the old days, we used to call this a political warfare operation. Because in the old days, the old KGB would go to a country, they would buy a printing press, they would take a bunch of money, not a lot of money because they were cheap, because they were communists, and they would try to influence people, and they would change the mediascape by doing salacious reports and blackmailing people. And the Russian word for that is kompromat, to compromise you. Clearly, they didn't have to do that this time. With a bank of people that could sit in a room and they could steal everything from the DNC and hand it off to their laundromat, WikiLeaks, who would take that information and present it to the world as legitimate information. And the US news media would eat it up. And that's precisely what happened. Does everybody remember what happened the morning of the DNC? The Bernie Sanders protest? All of these people saying the Democratic Party is going to split? That was the operation. But you don't attack the Democratic Party and make it split for fun. We don't do that in the intelligence community. We have goals. And those goals must be quantifiable. Those goals must actually produce an effect. And there's only one thing. If you knock Hillary Clinton out of the election and create chaos and split the Democratic Party in half, what happens on election day? You elect the other person. So why was all this effort? That's when I started writing that book. That afternoon, that morning of 25 July, the first day of the Democratic National Committee, I finally got permission from NBC News to come and say what I had been hammering them for days and saying. And it was so funny because Joy Reid, we were sitting at Independence Hall, she sits there and she doesn't really know what I'm here to say because they were like, okay, get up to the studio, go ahead and do your thing. And she's like, Malcolm, you have something you'd like to say? I'm like, yeah. I said, the United States has been attacked in a broad-scale cyber warfare, political warfare operation designed to split the Democratic Party in half and elect Donald Trump president. And it has been carried out by Russian intelligence. I am the first person in U.S. media to make that statement. I'm not even a journalist, so that's something. But the important point is, from that day on, that morning on, that was how we framed this operation. And you wouldn't believe the number of people that laughed at me. I had people just coming out of the woodwork going, that's absolutely ridiculous. Then you explain to me how all of these WikiLeaks reports, what they were for. If you read the emails, Debbie Wasserman Schultz was a close personal friend of Hillary Clinton. Is it a far stretch of the imagination to think that she might be voting for Hillary? Right? This is ridiculous. But they were saying, no, she somehow engineered Bernie Sanders losing the primaries by 4 million votes. Because that's what they want you to believe. Because the only result that could stem from that is the election of Donald Trump as president. In my world, we don't look at the who, what, when, where. We can collect that. That's hard intelligence. Analysis, determining where that all comes from, is an intelligence assessment. And intelligence assessments give you why. Why did they decide to risk the wrath of the United States by breaking into a party and putting their thumb on the scale, then their hand on the thumb of the entirety of the U.S. electorate? This is the first time in American history that our nation was attacked in its own elections. The fundamental part of our American experience. And a foreign government thought they are vulnerable enough, they are divided enough, and if we do this, if we dedicate all the resources of our national political, intelligence, and special operations resources, using our spy agencies, using our version of NSA, using their, CIA, their clandestine service people, the SVR, we can choose a president of the United States. And I said this very, very early on, well before my dear friend John Brennan, director of the CIA, said it. This is the greatest intelligence operation in history, and it is the most successful intelligence operation in history. It's not that they elected a president. We've done that. We've overthrown governments. We've put people in power. But that president didn't have atomic bombs. He didn't have 4,000 atomic bombs. And he didn't eliminate the entirety of the American global experience since the end of World War II and put it in the hands of Russia and China. Do you know what my favorite thing is? When people go, I hate globalism. You know, we invented that. America invented globalization, right? Everything we built, when my ma was working in World War II, my dad was fighting in World War II, all of those spam, jeeps, trucks, fuel, pipelines, oil tankers, Liberty ships, all of that was the beginning of globalization. And it was based on America's effort in the world to push out American productivity into the war zones. And at the end of the war, everybody wanted Spam. Everybody wanted a Ford truck. We wanted replacement parts for all those Jeeps that were left behind. Everybody wanted to fly in comfort on, C-47 planes and go across the world. We had mastered. We created hundreds of thousands of qualified pilots, thousands upon thousands of qualified sea captains. Ships were sold for $5. And everyone in the world, in that destroyed world, wanted what we produced. We have a president of the United States that says that is the worst thing that ever happened to America. Explain to me how that works. Because You think that by giving 5,000 guys jobs in coal mining? The reason there was a coal mining industry was because the entire world wasn't operating on oil at that point in World War II. And everything was coal. And we were putting it on ships and globalizing all of that coal. And we had to put it in a protective framework against our global axis, the Soviet Union. And we called it NATO. First president in the history of the United States since the foundation of NATO who said NATO should be gotten rid of. Do you know who wanted to get rid of NATO? The Soviet Union. And it's just a coincidence that the president of Russia is a former Soviet communist KGB officer and director of Russian intelligence. You guys remember, did anybody remember what Nance's law is? Yeah, what is it? Coincidence takes a lot of planning, right? It's an old intelligence tool, but I've taken it for myself. Coincidence takes a lot of planning. So we just suddenly get this president who wants to dismantle the entirety of the American global entry and domination of global markets. And he wants to turn it over to the former director of the KGB. I would say that's a pretty successful operation. And if you ever get to Washington, D.C., please visit. I'm a member of the board of the International Spy Museum, and we have no less than 4 former directors of the CIA there. And there's some pretty colorful opinions. I'm not going to tell you what they are, but these are the guys who protected us against the KGB, FSB as they're called now, the SVR, their clandestine service, the GRU, Russian military intelligence. All of this led to that afternoon on the 25th of July, where I sat down after I made my little speech on MSNBC that morning, and I started writing The Plot to Hack America. I wrote Plot to Hack America. I started it 25 July. I finished it on September 2nd of last year. It went online publication on September 23rd. Interestingly enough, the CIA delivered an identical report at the top secret level to President Obama on the exact same day. I wonder how that happened. Because spies think alike. We're not journalists. We don't need 3 sources. We steal our source information, right? And then we wrap it all up, and then we use the depth of our experience of how we have seen these operations before to extrapolate a series of findings in an assessment. My book is just an unclassified intelligence assessment of how the Russians saw us, how they saw a candidate that they liked, and how they put their system in place to elect that candidate president of the United States. And the best part about it is the book came into bookstores about 4 weeks before the election. And I don't have to change a thing. People keep begging me, though, to say, you got to change that title from Tried to Steal the 2016 Election. You're right. I'm going to have to change that title. But you know what's worse? There's another side of this story that I haven't written, and I'm going to write, the sequel to Plot to Hack America. And it's the side of the Americans who decided that working with the Russians was an awesome idea. And the story of how U.S. intelligence caught them. And I want to leave you with just one thing. You know, people always go, wow, Malcolm, this is just an amazing story. But, you know, it's just an FBI investigation. Are you aware that this is not just an FBI investigation? What is happening now with Bob Mueller started as a national counterintelligence investigation. That means our government was hunting for U.S. citizens who were working as spies for Russia. So when they talk about Carter Page and Papadopoulos and all these guys, there has never been a spy hunt that entered the Oval Office. That's Tom Clancy level type of writing. but it's been muddied in these waters that this is a political operation. It's not. We're going to find out who, according to the New York Times, because I don't have my own sources on that, the people that our sister intelligence agencies in Europe found an American citizen or citizens who were in direct, repeated communications with known Russian intelligence officers. And those people knew it. That's called an agent. The people who would have responded to them who may not have known that it was Russian intelligence manipulating them, we call them assets. There are two types of assets. There's a witting asset in which you know you're getting paid or getting a benefit from a foreign government or agency. And then there are unwitting assets in which you just like what they're saying, but you don't know you're being manipulated. On 27 July 2016, Donald Trump made a speech in which he said, Russia, if you're listening, you should release the 33,000 hacked emails that you got from Hillary Clinton. Our news media will reward you greatly. In that one sentence, Donald Trump went from an unwitting asset, you like that? Went from an unwitting asset to a witting asset. Because he knew Russia was working in his interest. Now I'm going to tie that back to that little story I told you about Judge Napolitano at the beginning. Remember Judge Napolitano went on Fox News, said they got 20,000 Hillary Clinton's emails? Well, clearly it appears that it jumped from Fox News to Donald Trump in that 3 months. And the number just went up to 33,000 in Donald Trump's head. But you have to go back. Where did Judge Napolitano get that story from? Does he wiretapping Vladimir Putin's inner sanctum? Sitting around in a dacha drinking vodka with these guys? No. 2 months before, in February of 2016, there was a news article released by an extremely crazy right-wing blog, very tiny. And it appears the source of that article was an American who either wrote it or was given it. We don't know yet. And it was the same thing. Russia having a debate about 20,000, emails. But the original source of that article was an article from Sputnik News in Russia. And that's where Russia inserted that story into the American news media. And they had to have known that Judge Napolitano would read that, or somebody at Fox News would read that, and then did. And then it made it to Fox News, was broadcast around the nation. 2 months later, Donald Trump is mimicking that same story, introduced by Russia into the American crazy blogosphere, picked up by the mainstream media. It's coming out of the mouth of the President of the United States. If that were the only source of information, this story would be short and over with. But now we're finding out that there were no less than 3 or 4 more other Russian dirty tricks teams that were out there making contact with multiple members of the Trump campaign. The Russians, like I said, this is an old school KGB operation. And the reason you use trusted, tried and true methods of the KGB is because they worked from 1917 right up to 1989, from the beginning of the Soviet Union to the end of the Soviet Union. But there's one thing that I've learned that the Russians like. They like face-to-face meetings. And when they're handling you, they want to make sure that you know what the story is. And that's why the Washington Post has counted over 20 unreported meetings with the Russians. But that's the Russian side of the story, and that's what you're going to read about in Plot to Hack America. The other side of the story is, what were those Americans thinking? What did they think that was of greater value than controlling the levers of power of the United States government? Because that's where that story's going, right? Why else would you meet with Russian diplomats and then not report it to your security report, your security clearance report? Because something was more valuable that you needed to hide. Either you have dirty dealings, or they have information on you, or you were promised something. And the worst part is, if I had said that 2 years ago, I would have said, I'm not writing that. That's conspiracy theory stuff. I don't have to. I have an entire special counsel who is proving everything that I projected true. It was awesome on October 7th last year when President Obama came out and essentially said the plot to hack America is 100% accurate. He didn't use those words. He said the Central Intelligence Agency has had a finding that the Russians have interfered with the U.S. election in an effort to elect Donald Trump president, which is the entirety of the book, The Plot to Hack America. And when you read the book, I'm going to tell you what's different between my assessment and the CIA report. I named the Russian operation, because all good spies name an operation. I named it Operation Lucky 7. The CIA named it Grizzly Step. That's it. The only difference between the two books. So with that, I hope you read it. It's been out 15 months. Still, my best-selling month was last August, because this story's not going anywhere, right? And if you need to get the ground truth on what happened in this election from an intelligence perspective, that's it. So I'm willing to take questions. All right. Anybody got any questions? Thank you. All right, come on up to the mics and yak.
Hard to know where to begin. It's wonderful to see you. When one sees you on MSNBC, one says that guy knows what he's doing. A couple of questions, I guess.
Yeah.
Tillerson's destruction of the State Department. I mean, did Putin actually, do you think, basically dictate or have a hand in who Trump would appoint? That's one question. Another is, given Mueller's investigation going somewhat slowly in terms of what it comes up with, it's sort of exasperating that there's no big bombshell in terms of, did Trump know this stuff?
Bombshell? Jeez, man. You got indictments.
Indictments. But they're saying Papadopoulos is low level. I guess what I'm getting at is, what do you expect to happen with this Mueller investigation?
Well, let me take the first State Department question first. We won't know why Tillerson's there, but, it doesn't take a rocket scientist or it doesn't take a career in intelligence to answer that question yourself. Here's a guy, he is the head of ExxonMobil. He has a pending deal for $500 billion pending before the United States government. He's the person who can lift sanctions, and his last act in Russia was to receive the Order of Friendship from Vladimir Putin. Right? And you pick him to dismantle U.S. diplomacy, which was Hillary Clinton's department, and essentially turn it over to defense, and essentially operate that as a business development office. Doesn't take a lot of no rocket science here to figure out that something is eventually going on. There had to be a good reason to choose the guy with the Order of Friendship from Russia. Now, this is another thing. People expected all these sanctions to be lifted immediately. You don't play the game like that. Tillerson knows better than that. There has to be something behind it. Something that's going to be good for ExxonMobil, something that's going to be good for Rex Tillerson, and something that's going to be good for Donald Trump. Now, this is where in the Christopher Steele dossier, he assessed that there was a 4.5% or 5% commission on the lifting of sanctions on Russia, which turns out to be about $19 billion commission. $19 billion. If there's 19 of us, everybody becomes a billionaire. You become a Russian oligarch overnight, right? It would be in your interest to get the guy who could lift those sanctions and make sure that that ExxonMobil deal go through, right? The guy who's running ExxonMobil. I mean, that's my assessment. And I want to see how that shakes out. When this all gets played, is Rex Tillerson innocent in this? Maybe he is. Maybe Rex Tillerson's witness for the prosecution number one. But Donald Trump has made it clear he doesn't need a State Department. It's all about him. He can do it himself. Twitter is his State Department. He doesn't believe in speaking to other people. And Jared Kushner's on the scene. So there you go. What was the second part of your question?
Well, basically what's going to happen. But I mean,
Oh,
with
well.
all these meetings going back and forth, one can see a greedy Trump wanting all the information he can get because he's unethical. Just I don't care where it comes from, but what's the quid pro quo? Where's the
I just remembered part of your question based on that. You know, Papadopoulos isn't the low-hanging fruit. When this thing started, when they came out with said the day before indictments are coming down, we didn't know who, everyone kept saying this: these indictments are coming really early in the investigation. They indicted the former campaign manager of the President of the United States, arguably number 3 or 4 in the chain of command. That's almost the top of the food chain. But he was easy. He was so dirty. I mean, there was so much dirty money out there. This guy was calling Cyprus to pay off pizza bills and getting them to, no, I mean, $859,000 in suits. Really? Yeah, $20,000 in suits, and the rest of that money was being given to him after it was laundered in the United States. He was very easy to take down because we had a lot of intelligence about him. Papadopoulos, on the other hand, is the low end of the food chain. Now you got the upper end of the food chain and the bottom of the food chain. Everyone in between is getting convicted or is going to talk. And that's how a good prosecutor would do it. You squeeze them from the top and the bottom. And then once you've gotten everyone to flip and you've got everyone's words about what they think, what they saw, Reince Priebus, Hope Hicks, all the rest of them, you have a documentary record in which to go to Jared Kushner and see if he's going to lie to you. Steve Bannon, see if he's going to lie to you. Donald Trump Jr., see if he's going to lie to you. And as they lie and obstruct, they each get nailed. This is just awesome gumshoeing, right? So I hope that answers your question.
What happens in the investigation if they fire Mueller?
Oh, there won't be any of that. All right. Next question, I'll answer that, but while the next speakers come out. Hey, you know when they fired Comey? This actually happened. I love telling this story this way. So they fire Comey. Comey takes his classified summary report, sits it in a safe, right? The day Bob Mueller comes on board, he goes to the safe, they take that classified report out, opens up the thing, sits down with a cup of coffee, starts reading. Reads. The end of the day, he reads the report of whatever Comey had. He picks up the phone, he makes his first hire. He calls the former director of the Treasury's Financial Crimes Division and says, I need you here right away. And then he hires 16 more mafia, money laundering, and corporate financial crime lawyers. What was in the report? Whatever it is, it required the top 17 financial crime lawyers in America. That's how bad things are. And if you don't think that they're hiring all those financial crime lawyers to look into someone's tax returns, then you don't understand how criminal fraud and all of these things work. And that's why this is just pure gumption. This guy's the former director of the FBI. He saved the FBI after 9/11. He's a cop and a prosecutor. You know, they say DA by night, cop by day. So he investigates and convicts all in the same spot. But all the people he hired are financial crimes lawyers? Pretty sure financial crime is going to be a big part of this game. So, your question, sir.
Wait, Mr. Nance.
Oh, who's next?
Over here.
Where?
This way. I just wanted to.
It disappeared.
I wanted to alert you that there are 2 mics, so if you could
Real
please
quick.
alternate between
Okay.
the 2.
Yeah, ex-victim.
Super fast. Thank you, Malcolm. You're a totally electrifying person. You've gotten us through the last 15 months, or at least me, so I got to thank you for that. Really fast. MSNBC is on at my house from 5 to 11. It's like ruining my relationship.
Make sure your dog watches it.
Yes. One thing...
Wait a minute. How's it ruining your relationship?
One thing that is not ever getting discussed, it's never with Rachel, with Joy, and I want to ask an intelligence professional, is what is our culpability when it comes to the effectiveness of this operation as Americans? What percentage is it? Because would this operation have been as effective if we knew how to distinguish between facts in this country anymore.
Yeah.
And I feel like it's just going to happen again in 2018 and 2020.
Yeah.
What is our culpability?
You know, Naveed Jamali actually has been handling that on MSNBC, and Joy Reid has brought it up several times about, and I have actually said this phrase that I will repeat here today. The election was not hacked at the voting booth. And I was on TV from July to, election day saying they're not going to hack the actual voting machines. If they're going to go after anything, they're going to go after the vote tallies and sow chaos. But President Obama picked up the phone, called up Vladimir Putin, said, do not touch anything related to the actual votes. They didn't have to. What they hacked was the mindset of the American public. Every person who believed and went after and looked for the Hillary Clinton email stuff, your mindset was hacked. Because if you read the emails, they're pretty damn boring. What they wanted was not the content of the emails. They wanted you to believe that emails of a 67-year-old grandmother would be the death of the United States of America. How stupid is that? I read Podesta's stuff. I mean, geez, the risotto recipe was the most interesting thing that they had out there. And I was like, this is ridiculous. What they were doing was putting the word emails above crazy, to the point where every person was waiting for the emails. Brilliant. Pure ex-KGB information warfare operation. And you're right, we are all culpable. Okay, I'm going to ask this question because I have to get this out. Anybody read Louise Mensch? Nobody? Come on. One of you guys got to be Team Patriot. Yeah, you wouldn't be in this room. A crazy person who puts out what I call impeachment porn or impeachment fanfic, promising that there's a super secret indictment by the Marshal of the Supreme Court imminent any day now. Pure fiction. And she always seems to scoop the entirety of the U.S. media every time the U.S. media puts out a scoop. Right? We've got to stop that. We have no room for an info wars on the rational, sane reality side. You're all adults here. Common sense is, I say this all the time, the least used intelligence analysis tool. Please use common sense. No one is going to be frog marching Donald Trump from the White House this year, maybe the year after, who knows? That depends on whether anybody votes. Yep. All right. Next question, real quick. Sorry about that.
So this past week, MSNBC broke a story about Rex Tillerson changing the security on the U.S. Embassy in Moscow.
Yeah.
And giving it to a KGB operation. Well, perhaps not a KGB operation, but
ex-KGB general who was a friend of Vladimir Putin.
But I haven't heard anything. Seems to be no outrage.
Well, there can't be a lot of outrage because perimeter security at the American embassies are always handled by the host nation. And we pay for that through contract security, but they guard the outside of the fence.
Oh, so this is just the outside?
Yeah, they don't come inside. That's run by the Marines and contract security contractors for the State Department. Not missing anything. That's all right. They don't have to. They can just go down to Foggy Bottom and get everything they want right now. All right? No, I'm not lying. Next question, real quick.
Yes, I understand that you said our mindset was hacked, and that's the worst kind of hacking because it's like verbal abuse. It doesn't leave bruises, but it leaves a lot of damage.
Oh, I'm going to write that down.
Wow, I just came up with that one. That was good.
Yeah, you should write a book.
But talking about mindset, why do you think that there's such denial in this country on both sides to acknowledge the obvious of the hacking of the election? There's a real denial for America to see how damaging that has been and continues to be. Why do you think?
Why do we have Newtown truthers, right, who won't believe that 26 children and teachers were shot to death? Why do we have 9/11 truthers? I saw an airplane fly into the Pentagon right before my eyes. And I have people who will call me a liar to my face, right? Because Our perception of what is real has been re-engineered due to the internet. 30 years ago, John Birchers would have had to have met you on the street and handed you a pamphlet. Do you guys remember the Lyndon LaRouche people who would run around the airports and hand you pamphlets? That has all been modified to the point where they have an equal platform that you have. Equal. Their voice is equal to yours. Crazy has just as strong an opinion as yours does. A lot of people like crazy. And that's a technical term we use in the community. So you have to combat that, right? Don't be the info wars of the left or the center or whatever it is. And like you said, it's a form of abuse. You believe it and then you incorporate it. We have 33% of this population in the United States would rather elect a pedophile to office than a Democrat. And they've said it, right? That's crazy. Are we done? Oh, you guys have to listen to some other guy. You can ask me questions outside. We're doing the book signing. Thanks.
After this? I know. I checked first thing when I came in. I said, is he coming? They're like, no. How could he really? He just... I think so. I think they told me they're covering this. So don't act like this. It's Sundays. Hard for me to even get that much done once a week. A really small staff, and they would like me to do a daily program, but I just can't imagine. I don't want to be. I'm not a pundit. Like I'm not a comment on anything. Kind of person. Can you actually do recording? Yeah, I try. I get asked all the time. They'll go, "Can you be on the radio show or Fox or whatever?" And I'll go, "What's the topic?" They go, "Well, whatever." Is news of the day. I'm like, no, because I don't know anything about. I only know about what I studied, and I'm not a political analyst or anything like that. Can
water? Okay. It's very cold. Okay, everybody. Hi, how are you? Thanks for being at the Miami-Dade Book Fair. My name is Merle Wexler, and I'm a volunteer/instructor at several of the campuses, and I want to welcome you here. I am not going to go into the awards and accolades, of which there's a lot. So I'd rather save the time for the authors to speak, if that's okay with you. Is that okay with you? Okay. Okay, good. Also afterwards, I believe there's a book signing downstairs. So when they're done, somebody will take them, the authors, and you downstairs. And without further ado, I'm just going to turn it over to both of our authors. I don't know who's going to go first. Is it Ken? Okay. Ken's going to, huh?
I drew the short straw.
You drew the short straw. Anyhow, he drew the straw. And thank you so much again for being here. Hope you enjoy it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
So I think what Cheryl and I are going to do, we're each going to read some selections from our latest books, and then open it up for questions, which is personally what I would rather do for the whole session, but we'll give you a little bit of a taste of the book, of my book, and Cheryl will do the same for hers. So my book, Republican Like Me, How I Left the Liberal Bubble and Learned to Love the Right. And all books have some type of creation story, and mine starts on my home street of Hobart Street in Mount Pleasant, a part of Washington, D.C., where I live. And the story I'm about to tell doesn't necessarily paint my street in the kindest light. It's lovely, though. But it's a slice of America which I think is being replicated more and more across the country. So Mount Pleasant, nice neighborhood, very diverse, and that's where I'll sort of pick up the book early on. So our commitment to diversity is pretty complete when it comes to black, white, and brown, and to the rainbow colors of the gay pride flag. But it falls a little short when it comes to red and blue. The neighborhood is astonishingly Democratic and liberal. Hillary Clinton received 92.5% of the vote in the 2016 general election, and Jill Stein outpolled Donald Trump in my precinct by a narrow margin. During 2016, it was always very easy to spot a Bernie Sanders or a Black Lives Matter yard sign, but good luck finding one for Bush or Kasich, let alone Trump or Cruz. In the past, I never paid much attention to the political homogeneity of Hobart Street, other than a joke here or there with my neighbors. Hobart Street and the Mount Pleasant neighborhood, after all, aren't that different from the wider city, and let's face it, I fit in rather well, being a lifelong Democrat married to a Democratic staffer on Capitol Hill. It all seemed pretty natural until Porch Fest. Say what you want about Hobart Street, but it has a lot of team spirit. Every Halloween, the street is closed to traffic, and kids from miles around come here, certainly attracted by the efficient access to candy provided by row homes, and perhaps by the dead baby house, a neighbor who strings baby dolls in various bloody poses and then drops them down on the trick-or-treaters as they approach the front porch. I said we have team spirit, not good taste. Porch Fest is the other main festival of the Hobart social calendar, our annual block party held each June. Virtually every house in the block contributes something, a food stand, music, home-brewed beer, a slip inside for the kids. My wife, Beth, stays up all night baking cookies, which she cuts variously into the shape of the Washington Monument, the Capitol building, and a map of the District of Columbia. Some she decorates herself, but others are left unfrosted so the kids can wield the icing tubes like Junior Jackson Pollocks. They do that with uncommon enthusiasm, if not complete coordination. For days afterwards, our front step looks like the victim of a food coloring balloon prank. The highlight of Porch Fest is the annual parade, which is always led by a marching band, a fire truck from the local firehouse, the same vintage convertible that appears each Porch Fest and then is not seen again on Hobart Street for the rest of the year, and all the kids on the block, some riding bikes or scooters, others tunelessly playing musical instruments, or in the case of my 9-year-old son, Nate, now 10, randomly throwing a baseball up in the air. It's all hopelessly chaotic, like a band in which all the musicians are playing from different sheet music, and it's all wonderful. And every year the parade starts with the children reciting the Hobart Street Pledge. I always love the pledge, at least the concept of it, that in our increasingly entropic world, we share a community, an identity, a home here on Hobart Street. I love the pledge, that is, until I bother to listen to the words, which I discovered one year go something like this. I pledge allegiance to Hobart Street Northwest. Gay or straight, woman or man, all are welcome on Hobart Street, except for Republicans. The end of the pledge was meant to be all in good fun, I suppose, except that it reflects an uncomfortable truth. As much of my neighbors on Hobart Street speak to the values of diversity and tolerance, they have no real interest in viewpoint diversity. I have tried episodically and unsystematically to find a Republican on Hobart Street. They must be there. Our precinct is 94% Democratic, astonishing number on its face, but that must mean that there's still 6% somewhere. It's simple to find Democrats. Bernie banners, yes. Hillary bumper stickers, sure. Black Lives Matter yard signs, plenty of them. And everybody sucks, we're screwed 2016 sign that pops up right after the election, you bet. But evidence of support for Bush, Kasich, Cruz, Carson, or Trump, no, 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 and hell no. So that's the story of the beginning of this book. And it makes Hobart Street sound a little bit narrow-minded, but in truth, it is happening across the country. It's a little bit called the Big Sort. We're sorting ourselves into different neighborhoods, red neighborhoods, blue neighborhoods. The Washington Post did a poll during the last election in Virginia, purple state, evenly divided. And they asked Trump supporters, do you have any close personal friends or family members who are voting, who are going for Hillary? And they asked the same of Clinton supporters. Do you have any close personal friends or family members voting for Trump? And think about it. I mean, think how many people fall in that category in an evenly divided state. And about 60% of people on both sides of the aisle said they didn't know anyone voting for the other side. And when you don't know people on their side, it becomes really easy to demonize them. And that's really what's happened in this country. So for me, the Hobart Street Pledge was a starter's pistol on saying, you know, if I'm going to really talk about these issues, I need to see things from the other side. It's actually a quote from Atticus Finch that starts this off. You never really understand a person until you consider things from his point of view, from To Kill a Mockingbird. And that's what the book is about. My year leaving my 94% Democratic district, 100% Democratic household, and spending the year with Republicans. That means think tanks and hunts and churches and all the things, bars in Youngstown, Ohio, little mining communities in Pikeville, Kentucky, and really trying to understand things from the other side. And that's what the book's about. I want to read you just two quick selections from it. So one of the things early on, I read a quote in the Washington Post. Actually changed my media mix. I mean, I've spent my career at places like NPR, but I said if I'm going to see things from the other point of view, I started watching Fox a lot and reading Breitbart and all sorts of things. But I still read the Washington Post, and I saw a quote from the guy who runs Heritage Action, who said, you know, the people in the Acela corridor, apparently that's me, that's you too, they don't know the awesomeness of America. I said, I got to do that. I got to find the awesomeness of America. And where do you go? So I called up Tucker Carlson, who I knew slightly, and went to see Tucker and said, Tucker, I need to find the awesomeness of America. Where do I go? It's kind of a strange question, but literally that's what I said. And he sort of paused for about half a second, which is about as long as Tucker Carlson will ever pause. And he says, go pig hunting in Texas. And I did. So I flew to Houston, drove out to Gonzales, Texas, confessed to the guy who ran the place that I'd never shot a gun before. And he was a little bit perturbed by that. And he thought I was a danger to myself and others, which is probably true. And he sent me off by myself, which makes for, he said, the pigs will come to me. They did not. So I wandered off, and this is a selection I'll pick up, wandered off looking for people to hunt with. Fortunately, no one mistakes me for the world's only upright day-glow pig, and I soon make new friends. Turns out once you're liberated from hunting purgatory, Independence Ranch is quite a lovely place for a stroll. The trees are high and thick, a peaceful silence hangs over the place, and except for the occasional and distant sound of gunfire, it is all terribly tranquil. Spread to my right is CJ, and to my left is his 8-year-old son, Isaac. Somewhere out further in the woods is CJ's father, who was later introduced to me only as Paps. The three of them had driven 14 hours from their home in Georgia 2 days before, and will be making the long drive home tonight. We've been walking the woods for at least an hour, and it's had all the drama of a walk from my office to the local sandwich shop, except that trip holds out the promise of some food at the other end. We've seen a few troops of pigs in the distance running fast and always the wrong way, but not nearly close enough even to contemplate a shot. It doesn't bother CJ or Isaac, since the day before, in young Isaac's evocative words, they had already shot the shit out of a bunch of pigs. But I'm antsy, concerned that I will go through my day without any real action. After a while, CJ goes off to find Paps, leaving me to stalk pigs alone with Isaac. You might think it is a risk, leaving your young son with an armed stranger, but it seems natural amid the comfortable camaraderie of the hunt. In truth, it is Isaac who quickly establishes leadership in our two-man band. When I keep forgetting basic rules of gun safety, like swinging the gun in his direction every time I turn to talk to him, it is little Isaac who gently reminds me to keep the gun pointed toward the ground at all times. Fortunately, he takes a bit of a shine to me, perhaps because he perceives me as just another kid, albeit a rather large, bald, and apparently dim-witted one who has trouble grasping the simplest rules of hunting. We walk together for the balance of the morning, never getting close enough to the pigs to take a shot, but sharing hunting stories as men do. Although we're short a man, I have no hunting stories to tell. Isaac does have some nice stories about his hunting trips with his father and grandfather, although they all devolve at some point into shooting the shit out of things. To see a kid like Isaac handle himself in this way is remarkable to see. I love my son Nate. He is a whiz at math and a walking encyclopedia of baseball history, but I wouldn't trust the kid with a particularly pointy stick, let alone a loaded rifle. Everyone I met at the Independence Ranch learned to shoot at 5. And Isaac has guns hanging over his bed at home in Georgia. The reason I ultimately went, other than Tucker's advice, went pig hunting is because I wanted to challenge myself on an issue which I thought I had to be right on gun control versus gun rights. Going to Gonzales, Texas, just a slice of my research, but it's sort of an evocative moment because Gonzales is about 8 miles as the crow flies from Sutherland Springs, Texas, where the last big church shooting took place about 3 weeks ago. It's 8 miles by crow, about 30 miles by road, and that's part of the story. And one of the things you see in things like Sutherland Springs is everyone takes different things away from that. Liberals take, holy cow, we need gun control. People running there around with AR-15s, there are 100 million of them in this country, shooting up a lot of places, and we need gun control. Conservatives look at it and say, wait a minute, it was an NRA instructor who pulled his own AR-15 and ultimately diffused the situation because there was no cop coming for 30 minutes. One of the bumper stickers you'll see at gun shows I saw was, I'd rather have a gun in my hand than a cop on the phone. And there's all sorts of, people take all sorts of different lessons from the same set of facts. That's part of the story here, was trying to see things from different points of view. And it was sort of an extraordinary experience. One last, am I running too late? Too long?
Sounds good to me.
Right.
I want to hear more.
All right. Get closer to the mic. Thank you. Any other instructions? I take instructions well. I want to tell you about just my trip a little bit to Pikeville, Kentucky. I want to give you a little bit of context to it. And I want to tell you a sort of a study by a company, no one's really talked about this, called Sentier Research. And it sort of sets up a trip into, really into the Trump base. the white working class, which is the group that really carried him to victory. In October 2016, spurred by the rise of Donald Trump, a firm called Centier Research looked at the change in economic status for white men with college degrees compared to white men with only high school degrees. Change in fortune for those two groups over the study period of 1996 to 2014 was extraordinary. It was a good time to have a college degree. Incomes for college graduates in real terms rose 23%. Those with only a high school education, on the other hand, saw a reversal of fortune. Income expressed in 2014 dollars actually fell 9% over that period. It's a shocking number. At a time of broad economic expansion, a huge cross-section of the American workforce experienced a Depression-era effect on their income. Centier did one other interesting thing. They ran what they called a cohort analysis, following the incomes of different age groups through the 18 years of the study. For example, the average 25-year-old white college graduate student in 1998 earned $40,000, $40,487 if you're counting. Over the next 18 years, as he acquired more experience and more expertise, and as he received promotions and seniorities, his income rose to $94,000, or by about 132%. It's a nice progression. It's perhaps what you would expect over the course of a solid career. But if you had only a high school education, it is an entirely different picture. Your income in 1996 would have been a step lower at $32,000. Again, that is roughly what you might expect, a solid and not overwhelming 20% differential from a similarly situated person with a college degree. But the real differences emerge only over time. Unlike the college composite, as a high school graduate acquired experience, knowledge, and wisdom, his earnings barely budged. By 2014, the typical high school grad would have been in his mid-40s and probably close to the top of his earning potential, and yet his income would only be $38,000. Think about it for a moment. In those 18 years, our newfound high school friend might have acquired a spouse and kids and car payments and perhaps a mortgage. He might have put in 2 decades of hard physical labor. His body might be breaking down, his health care needs might be rising up, and might be grappling with aging parents and other assorted responsibilities. And he would barely have more money than when he was 25 years old and relatively unencumbered. It is an enormously bleak picture, and if he'd known back in 1996 what he would be facing 18 years down the road, he might have given some serious thought to just ending it all. And that's exactly what more and more working class whites are doing. The white working class, which is sort of a little bit of an arc of the story, sort of on a 30-year losing streak. Mortality rates down, mortality rates up, income levels down, opioid addiction up, sense of opportunity, sense of the American dream way down. And that's really part of the story of the 2016 electorate. So let me just tell you about one fellow I met, and then I'll turn it over to Cheryl. A guy named Walter Dixon. So Walter, I'm going to sort of skip some of the preamble and just sort of tell you. Well, let me say, like many I met, Walter Dixon found his first job in the mines with the expectation that he'd secured employment for life. And for a number of years, it all went rather well. He started as a scale house operator making $13 an hour, but was quickly elevated to running a coal washing operation making $20 an hour. Goes a long way in Pikeville, long enough that Dixon could make a good living and even bypass overtime in favor of spending more time with his wife and infant son. But in September 2013, his employer, the James River Coal Company, abruptly closed 4 Kentucky coal mines, and with hours, Dixon, along with more than 500 other miners and support personnel, was on the street. Along with a job went all sense of a semblance of economic certainty. It is one thing to lose a job, many of us have been disfavored with that experience, but another thing to lose a job when your local economy is in free fall. With the exception of a brief interlude when mining resumed, Dixon has been formally unemployed since, living off the underground economy. He has an electrician's skills, but not an electrician's license, so a local electrician has paid him cash under the table for occasional piecework. On the day I met him, he was on the way to interview for a salesman job with Transamerica Insurance. He smiled at me and said, hopefully it's the best shot I've had for a long time. Like everyone else I spoke to in Pikeville, Dixon views the federal government as an oppressive force, the instrument of the coal industry's downfall in Kentucky via clean coal regulations. The story is similar to Martinsville, where I went to the NASCAR races, in the sense that economic forces are perceived to be in the hands of distant corporations or indifferent government decision makers. None of the stories are as clean or as neat as the locals have you believe, but it's much easier to rally against a form of internal colonialism than it is against market forces and economic changes. For Dixon, the sense of grievance, of abandonment by those who are supposed to help them, has led him to Donald Trump, not out of any great affection. And I'll just put parentheses, this is a very typical experience I had during the year. Not in a great affection, but out of the belief that he will either, quote, be a great leader or launch World War III. That comment is worth a pause because that is not a bet I would make on my own behalf or for the country, but when you're on your back in Pikeville looking up from the bottom of the pyramid, the perspective is quite a bit different. So I'm going to pause there, and hopefully we can pick up that conversation during the Q&A time.
Great job. Okay, I'm Cheryl Atkinson. Can you hear me okay? And my book is called The Smear, as some of my friends like to call it, the schmear. How shady political operatives and fake news control what you see, what you think, and how you vote. So I think I'll just get right to my excerpts, which explain some of my thought process and what the book is about. Nearly every day, my overloaded email inbox is peppered with pleas from viewers asking, no, begging me to investigate tales of the implausible and unbelievable. They're convinced that the truth is being hidden from them on a massive scale, that someone is manipulating what they see on the news and online, conspiring to hide select facts and advance particular narratives, colluding on plots to smear certain people. Their suspicions are correct, even if their notion of the truth is often confused. In fact, the confusion is often by grand design. At the end of campaign 2016, one story they urged me to investigate is Pizzagate. It's a twisted conglomeration of unthinkable accusations about Democratic presidential nominee Hillary Clinton and her inner circle. News of this shocking scandal has been circulating on the internet, and conspiracy theorists believe the mainstream press is covering it up. The allegations are whispered about and forwarded through social media, quasi-news sites, blogs, and videos posted by nameless sources. The stories are filled with names of real people and places, blended with fabricated tales of child rape, a porn ring, and a pizza parlor supposedly trafficking in underage sex through a basement tunnel. A mysterious video posted under the moniker Anonymous promises that the final week of the campaign will reveal irrefutable evidence of indictable crimes. The sources of this as yet unrevealed information, according to the video, have been contacted by the FBI, which is getting ready to sweep in and make arrests. I'm busy working on pressing stories for my weekly news program, Full Measure, at the time, but I poke around in case there's anything to any of it. I look at the websites, I check out the videos, I consult sources who might know if there are real law enforcement investigations underway. I quickly detect telltale signs of misinformation. Meanwhile, Donald Trump faces his own parade of false accusations, and I'm getting emails about those as well. Viewers want to know why I'm not reporting on the story about him having raped a child. I look into that one too. There's a lawsuit pending, and the players involved are at least as dubious as the ones promulgating Pizzagate. Still, the Trump story gets picked up by the likes of the New York Daily News, Politico, BuzzFeed, New York Magazine, The Independent, The Atlantic. As cameras gather for a news conference to hear the sordid tale from the supposed rape victim, she evaporates. There are more concocted stories that Trump's New York City modeling agency was caught trafficking young girls and hiding them in basements, that Trump is a secret plant who entered the presidential campaign as a pettifogger, surreptitiously working to get Clinton elected, that he's a stooge of Russian President Vladimir Putin in a Manchurian candidate scenario, a reference to the 1962 film about an American soldier who was brainwashed into carrying out communist plots. Not a day goes by without the voting public getting pummeled by countless narratives, some based on grains of truth, others wholly invented for the audience. Racist, Wall Street lackey, crooked liar, cheat, white nationalist, socialist, womanizer, misogynist, corrupt, xenophobic, homophobic, Islamophobic, anti-immigrant, basket of deplorables, fraudster, loser, alt-right, delusional, dangerous, mentally ill, pay-for-player, tax cheat. Assisted by ideologues, shady political operatives, and dark internet outfits seeking money-making clicks, Campaign 2016 shatters all records in the smear department. In this environment, the ability to execute a character assassination becomes more pivotal than any single campaign strategy. Operatives spring into action, exploiting the latest technology and tactics. Once relegated to grocery store tabloids, smears now figure prominently in most every mainstream news publication. Reporters pursue sordid narratives with the fervor of Jimmy Olsen chasing an exclusive for the Daily Planet. Smears become embedded in the fabric of our everyday existence, so common we barely flinch at the most audacious claims. With distrust of the news media at an all-time high, a skeptical public looks to alternative information sources and becomes easier to bamboozle. It's in this space, devoid of principles, where smears and fake news thrive. It's no longer a stretch for news consumers to believe that the press is covering up important stories or is in the tank for corporate and political interests. We didn't get here overnight. The past 2 decades have served as an ideal incubator for an industry of smears and fake news. The tools and tactics have evolved from old school to high tech. Incredible amounts of money changes hands, yet some of the most damaging smears can be accomplished with little more than an idea and an internet connection. By 2016, a Pew Research Center report found that more than 44% of the American adult population got its news on Facebook, which had 1.09 billion active daily users. Some of that news is true, some of it's not. Today, an entire movement can be started with a few bogus Twitter accounts and 140 characters or less. You don't have to spend millions on political ad buys anymore, observes one operative in the business. You can spark wildfires with just a tiny little stick now, which is a new thing. What exactly is a smear? It depends on who you ask. One man's smear is another man's truth. In simple terms, it's an effort to manipulate opinion by promulgating an overblown, scandalous, and damaging narrative. The goal is often to destroy ideas by ruining the people who are most effective at communicating them. What you may not know is that a lot of this manipulation is done through methods that are utterly invisible to the average consumer. Paid forces devise clever, covert ways to shape the total information landscape in ways you can't imagine. Their goal is to fool you. Public ideas are meticulously orchestrated to appear random. Op-eds printed in major news publications are ghostwritten by paid agents in the name of shills who rent the use of their signatures. Private eyes dig up dirt on enemies by dumpster diving for embarrassing information and compromising material. I'm going to skip ahead to, I thought you all, there's a lot written in the book about things other than the media and journalism industry, but I thought some of these excerpts about what we know about news industry collusion and behavior would be most interesting. So skipping ahead to a chapter I called Transactional Journalism, the Black Market Information Trade. Thanks to the persistent nature of email, we have documentary evidence of this ugly reality. Emails that expose the black market information trade. The transactional nature of relationships between newsmakers and the media. Every day, deals are being cut in secret, backs are scratched, one hand washes another. It makes it easy for special interests to advance an agenda or accomplish a smear. The past 9 years, there's been a breakneck acceleration in this disturbing trend. There have always been questionable dealings between some reporters and the interests they cover, both Democrat and Republican. But Barack Obama's presidency comes at a time where key factors conducive to transactional journalism coverage converge in an explosive way. Obama is the first Democrat elected to the nation's highest office since the invention of Facebook and Twitter, the first since the internet became firmly established as a means for journalists and their interests to frequently communicate in real time, and the first since the explosion in what I call quasi-news outlets online, which are often used to plant and feed narratives. Many left-leaning reporters who predominated major news outlets weren't interested in advancing the agenda of Obama's predecessor, George W. Bush, but they eagerly established dubious relationships with Obama agencies and officials, including then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. Proof of these relationships is contained within several collections of internal emails. Some of them were released under Freedom of Information Act requests and lawsuits. Others were published by WikiLeaks in 2016. They reveal an unseemly coziness among prominent journalists and government officials. Once upon a time, reporters caught engaging in such behavior could expect to be ostracized or even banished from the field of journalism. Today, these relationships draw little more than snickers and a silent sense of relief from colleagues. Relief because they're glad that their emails weren't exposed. The emails offer us a chance to become voyeurs, peering in on private dealings between reporters and propagandists, a form of commerce never meant to be seen by outside eyes. Emails dating back to Obama's first months in office unmasked transactional journalism conducted by Washington reporter Mark Ambinder from The Atlantic. He's also written for the New York Times, New Yorker, Washington Post, Vice, Hotline, ABC News, CBS News. This particular transaction takes place on July 15, 2009, as Secretary of State Clinton is set to make a speech. Under normal circumstances, Clinton aide Philippe Rines might have to work pretty hard to convince reporters to cover the speech at all. It's not of much interest to average folks. But in today's dynamic, an advance copy of the Clinton speech will be heralded as a great get, and Ambinder wants it. The question is, what's he willing to do to get it? In an email exchange, Rines, Hillary Clinton's aide, says there are certain conditions that Ambinder must meet in order to get the text of the speech. Ambinder replies, okay. Rines then dictates his terms in a numbered list. Number 1, you in your own voice describe Hillary's words as muscular. Number 2, you note that a look at the audience seating plan shows that all the envoys, from Holbrooke to Mitchell to Ross, will be arrayed in front of her, which in your own clever way you can say is certainly not a coincidence and meant to convey something. And number 3, you don't say you were blackmailed. Ambinder responds, got it. It's a remarkable scenario. Rines is a Clinton aide who's paid by taxpayers yet functioning like a private PR agent. It's the same at many federal agencies. Their press departments use their public positions to forward the agendas of their political bosses, all on our dime. In this instance, Ambinder poses as a journalist but agrees to serve the interests of the politician, all to get his hands on a speech that serves the interests of the politician. Here's an excerpt from Ambinder's final article. When you think of President Obama's foreign policy, think of Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. That's the message behind a muscular speech that Clinton is set to deliver today to the Council on Foreign Relations. The staging gives a clue to its purpose. Seated in front of Clinton, subordinate to Clinton, in the first row, will be 3 potentially rival power centers, envoys Richard Holbrooke and George Mitchell, and National Security Council Senior Director Dennis Ross. The article delivers everything Rines had demanded. Once these emails about it become public in February 2016, the Atlantic issued a statement that reads, "This is not typical and this goes against our standards." For his part, Ambinder insists the emails don't capture the totality of his communication and aren't indicative of his normal reporting techniques. He explains, the way Rines had described the Clinton speech, it was muscular. So I found the adjective appropriate. So muscular was my word. The decision to characterize the envoys was mine. No one fed me anything, period. It must be coincidence, then, that other reporters thought up the exact same unusual adjective when describing the Clinton speech. Washington fixture Mike Allen of Politico and formerly of the New York Times and Time also calls the speech muscular and notes the seating arrangement as Rines had instructed Ambinder to do. Likewise, the headline at New York Magazine uses the word muscular, and the article shows a cartoon of Clinton with bodybuilder arms. Happenstance? You decide. But when you notice the news media or pundits all seizing upon similar terminology, it's reasonable to suspect there's an orchestrated effort. There's more secret collusion between news reporters and federal officials, buried in emails between the CIA and Ken Delanian, an AP reporter who had previously covered the spy agency for the Los Angeles Times. These emails from 2012 reveal a surprisingly deferential and collaborative relationship, according to The Intercept, which obtained the emails in 2014. Delanian's interactions with the CIA include him explicitly promising positive news coverage and sometimes sending the press office entire story drafts for review prior to publication. This is a stark departure from normal ethical practices for journalists. I'm working on a story about congressional oversight of drone strikes that can present a good opportunity for you guys, Delanian writes to a CIA press official in April 2012, adding that the story will be reassuring to the public. Later, Delanian sends the CIA press office a draft of his story and invites them to weigh in. This is where we are headed, he writes, asking if they want to push back on any of this. Next, Delanian emails a softer version of his story, according to The Intercept, and asks, does this look better? The next month, he sends the CIA another story draft. Guys, I'm about to file this if anyone wants to weigh in, he writes. And in May 2012, again, he sends the CIA a story outline. This is what we are planning to report, and I want to make sure you wouldn't push back against any of it, he writes. Delanian later concedes to The Intercept that it was a mistake for him to send unpublished stories to the CIA. I shouldn't have done it, and I wouldn't do it now, he says. but it had no meaningful impact on the outcome of the stories. I probably should have been reading them the stuff instead of giving it to them. In September 2012, there's a fascinating email exchange between reporters and Clinton aide Rines shortly after the Benghazi, Libya terrorist attacks. CNN has just reported that it's found the diary of murdered U.S. Ambassador Christopher Stevens in the burned-out rubble of the compound where he'd come under attack. The diary chronicles Stevens' worries about lax State Department security. That contradicts the narrative that Clinton and other Obama officials are spinning. They claim there was no way they could have predicted that Stevens and other Americans were at risk. Rines attempts to discourage other journalists from reporting on the Stevens diary by launching a Kill the Messenger campaign. He fires off an extraordinary email blast to more than 100 reporters, accusing CNN of violating the privacy of Stevens' family by reporting on the diary contents. There's record of only one reporter in the whole bunch pushing back, the late Michael Hastings of Rolling Stone and BuzzFeed, who died 9 months later in a fiery single-car crash. In an email to Rines, Hastings defends CNN's reporting and asks why it was the cable news network rather than the State Department that recovered Stevens' diary. Hastings implied that if U.S. officials were sloppy enough to overlook the diary, they might have also left behind other sensitive, valuable intelligence. Your statement about CNN sounded pretty defensive, Hastings writes to Rines. Do you think it's the media's responsibility to help secure State Department assets overseas after they've been attacked? Rines replies, as far as the tone of my email about CNN, I think you're misreading mine as much as I'm misreading yours as being needlessly antagonistic. No, you read my email correctly. I found your statement to CNN offensive, Hastings counters. Hastings is an exception. Other emails to and from Rines indicate it was far more common for reporters to shower him with adulation and flattery. In May 2010, Rebecca Cooper, the host then of a local Washington Business News TV program, emails Rines, I heart you. In June 2010, Jeremy Peters of the New York Times is looking for dirt about Politico. So this is New York Times looking for dirt about Politico, and seems delighted when Rines comes up with a quote for him. Politico thinks if a light bulb is out, that's a story. That's brilliant, Peters raves. You should totally let me use that on the record. That's great. Anything else you can recall like that, their greatest hits of non-news, would be great. The Washington Post also turns to Rines for ideas on how to smear Politico. The Post's Ann Kornbluth emails to Rines, if you get bored in a meeting, want to send me some examples of Politico's most flagrant stupidity or errors? Why the jihad against Politico, by the way, is unclear. And under the heading of you wouldn't believe it if you didn't read it for yourself, other reporters send emails practically begging Rines to feed them propaganda. Massimo Calabresi, a Washington correspondent for Time, turns to Rines for help in producing a fawning 40 under 40 mini profile of Clinton confidant Jake Sullivan. What makes him successful in general? Sullivan at the time was widely considered a potential pick for a top Clinton post if she made it to the White House in 2016. Associated Press reporter Beth Fooey implores Rines for story assistance. I've been asked to do the Uma Abedin story. I really need your help, she pleads. CBS News submits a personal note telling Rines the network's about to launch a series on people who have achieved extraordinary success and made a significant contribution to society. The CBS reporter wants to include Hillary Clinton, of course. Maybe you thought the mission of reporters was to seek out original stories of interest to viewers, not smear one another and spread propaganda for favored interests. You thought State Department aides like Rines, paid with your tax dollars, would be spending their time serving the public. Instead, the media is being used as a private news agency creating a product intended for an audience of press and government insiders. So I will leave it there so we have time for questions and answers. Anybody?
If you guys have questions, we have microphones. I'm over here.
Okay.
We have microphones on either side of the room. You can just go up to them and ask your question. And we ask that you guys please alternate between the microphones.
I would like to ask Cheryl, if I may, where do you recommend that the average American can actually find news that doesn't seem to be so managed? And then a second question, if I may, could you shed some light on how news is packaged before it's released? For example, when the Access Hollywood expose on Trump came out, directly afterwards, there was a series of what was portrayed as spontaneous other eruptions of ladies who had also been supposedly or had accusations. But their videos seemed to be so well produced to me in regard to the lighting and just the staging of it. And whereas there were about, 9 or 15 different ladies that came out after Access Hollywood, the whole perception that I had was it all seemed to be synoptically managed or packaged, because it was all done so professionally and the timing seemed to be so coincidental. And possibly the same thing is happening in Alabama. I just wondered if you could shed some light on how these things so coincidentally happen.
Thank you. The book discusses how there's billion-dollar industries that make sure things happen on both sides, and for corporations as well, that organize this sort of thing. Doesn't mean they're false, but I do always give pause when I see these organized or highly organized seeming efforts. And even when they're not seemingly highly organized, if you listen to the smear artists quoted in my book, one of them said, every image you see that crosses your daily life, whether it's on the news, social media, or just things you hear put out by charities and comedy talk shows, whatever it may be, he says, are put there for a reason, often by highly paid interests that pay a lot of money to put them there. And if you start thinking of things in that context, you might become like me. I don't disbelieve everything I see initially, but I don't believe it initially until I know more. I'm smart enough to know that I need to do my own verification in this environment, even with the most obvious stories that everybody seems to agree on. So many times I do a little bit of investigating, looking at original sourcing, and find out something completely different. So I think you're right to listen to your instincts, to at least ask questions. And as to who to rely on for sort of a straight shot at the news, I think that's very difficult. I think there are great reporters at every news organization who are finding it more and more difficult to get their stories on unencumbered through the editorial process. So just based on your own experience, this is not a great answer, but I think you have to find reporters you trust on certain stories at different publications and rely on them, and don't take things at face value without knowing more yourself. Thank you.
My question is for Ken. As somebody who believes that in order to understand somebody, you have to, like they say, step in their shoes and listen to them, and as somebody who believes that the free market of ideas is the best way for you to be solid on your belief, and being somebody that is an ex-Republican, now having switched to the other side and being circled and in contact with people that have ACLU members, something that I never would have thought myself would become, I'm realizing that on both sides there's these extreme points of views, and nobody wants to hear something different. So for me, the step that you took would be the ideal thing, to expose yourself to the other side, be open-minded, and listen. And my question to you would be, as you went through this experience, have you found that some of your beliefs before have shifted more towards the other direction, only because you now have listened to the argument and come to the conclusion, well, I used to think this way, this is now a valid point, now I'm shifting a little bit more towards where I didn't used to be before?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I started off as a Democrat. I switched my party registration to Republican for the year. I was going to whole hog, go in for it, and I didn't know what would happen when I finished. I know enough about sort of social science and motivated reasoning to believe that I might see things from the other side and learn a bit, and I did. But what I found out, and I sort of changed my views on some issues, and that's part of the narrative of the book. But I found out sort of two things. I sort of took away two things in the end. One of which is, despite all the narrative around polarization, what hasn't changed is actually issue polarization. Attitude polarization has changed. We hate the other side. But actually, American views on the issues haven't changed very much over the last 25 years. We remain a surprisingly moderate people, and even people you talk to think of themselves as down the pike liberal, downpike conservative actually turn out to be much more nuanced in real life. So I came away much more skeptical of the overarching story that there's one side or the other and there's no in between. Because in fact, when you sit down with people, you often find there's easy to find common ground. One of the stories I tell in the book is a guy named Sam Adams, not the Patriot brewer, but the mayor of Portland, Oregon, the first openly gay mayor of a major U.S. American city. And the biggest partnership he forged during his tenure as mayor of Portland was with the evangelical community. And what he told me and what he's consistently said over the years is, look, I'm not going to agree with him on abortion. I'm certainly not going to agree with him on gay rights. But in 8 out of 10 things that matter to the community, we're going to agree on each other. Why are we talking about those two when we should be talking about how to succeed on the 8? And that's really sort of where I came out. I'm now a registered independent, and I'm comfortable trying to take ideas from both sides.
There's someone up there. No.
Okay. Hi, this is for Cheryl. Do you think that there is a real proliferation of this behind-the-scene narrative in media, or maybe I think it's just we're coming out of the closet with it, because it's always been there, but now it's easier to expose and see behind the scenes what is going on in these exchanges between reporters and people in influential places. It's always happened. We just have a window now to see it, and it's part of the culture of America to exchange services for something. We start doing it with our kids. They're always negotiating with their parents about everything now. So why should it be different in news?
I agree with your observations. There's a little bit about history of that sort of thing in the book. I think it's always been around, like you say, and everybody tries to do it. Everybody wants to influence the media, of course. But I do think at the same time there's an explosion in the organized industry that has figured out how to use modern tactics to accomplish their goal, and as I say, peek their nose under the tent of news organizations, influence the narratives that they discuss on a daily basis. It's a very sophisticated and learned way that they've gone about this over the past probably 2 decades to develop and hone the jobs that they do, and that's discussed in the book. Thank you.
Hi, my question is for Ken Stern. I have a number of relatives and grammar school friends who are conservatives. None of them embody the economic anxiety and bad luck that you've explained. All of them embody assorted flavors of bigotry. So are you sure you didn't mishear that quote, that what they were really telling you was the awfulness of America, not awesomeness?
Funny. Look, there are 125 million people who voted in the last election. It's 125 million stories. And I can only tell you 2 things, my experiences and what the data shows. And I met tons of people. I mean, I met lots of people who voted for Obama and voted for Trump. And to me, that was a little bit of the story of this election, is that attitudinal change among people. And I think if you look at the data, there's always been racial prejudice. There probably always will be racial prejudice that drives some of the voting behaviors, but those voting behaviors really haven't changed. This year is no different if you look at sort of the crosstabs in the electoral history, and people's answers to why they voted. That really hasn't changed very much over the years. What has changed, I think, is, and what drove this victory is the sense of, look, Trump got 62 million votes. Some of that was white working class, some of it wasn't. But the shift, he won the white working class by 39%. And that's where he won Ohio, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin. And that was he only needed 78, he only won those by 78,000 votes. And that was really the shift that has occurred. And I think that is a question. Look, it doesn't take going around the country to actually know when you find a community of people, whatever color they are, who are on a 30-year economic decline, whose sense of optimism, it's actually a lot of polling on sense of optimism about the future, largely gone, that's going to be a very angry, unhappy people, and they're going to cast ballots in that way. And if we don't understand, I mean, the Democrats after the election said, we got to get back in touch with these voters that historically are voters. As far as I can tell, they really haven't done anything to change that. So, you have your narrative. I don't dispute it. I have mine. But I think the story of the election, if you want to look at it, really is the anger from different parts of the country and how that played out in terms of voting patterns.
So in the spirit of your book, then, we can agree to disagree. Thank you.
Hey, this question's for Cheryl. So I work in campaigns and politics, and I completely agree with your thesis. I think so many times I've seen it where there's this need for narrative that facts get kind of forgotten. I've had on several occasions people try to explain to me things about legislation that I was involved in passing that I have no idea where they get it from. It's happened so many times where people have told me stories about either campaigns or legislation where I was like literally there, and I'm just like, where'd you get this like fanatical story from? Like, none of that ever happened. And then they'll point to really reputable sources. So my question is, a lot of the topics that I see covered in media today, I get the majority of my news from Twitter and people I know in real life. I don't really have news outlets on a day-to-day basis. But a lot of these stories are really complex issues that honestly, maybe only like 100 people in the State Department truly have the capability to understand. So do you think part of this problem comes from like a public's kind of pseudo-intellectual pursuit to want to grapple with topics that they don't necessarily have the time for or really the education for? They're very, very, very well-educated people who, the one thing I've learned in politics is how little I know. In my 8-year career is how little I know about public policy. Every single day I realize like how less and less I know. And do you think that plays into all of this? That publics like need to be like, well, I'm a foremost expert on Iran, but I spend 60 hours a week selling insurance. But I know everything about Iran. Let me talk about Iran like an expert, and let me read this New York Times article that will make me feel that way.
It's that syndrome of we feel like we're an expert because we did a little research or read an article or two, and then we pontificate as if we know. I do think there's some of that. But I also would argue the subjects that are making it to the plate in our news diet are so orchestrated in many cases. I mean, I came from a University of Florida school where if a story was handed to you, if someone presented you with a press release, you were not to cover that as a news story. That was a beginning point. That's what somebody wanted you to believe. So your job was, if it seemed newsworthy, to find out the truth. Maybe it's true, maybe it's not, maybe it's part truth. Today, I feel as though these industries that I talk about have figured out how to place on the plate at news organizations through ways that news organizations don't even always see themselves, topics they want covered in a certain way, framed in a way that you may hear come back to you that don't even seem to ring true, but somebody's framing that way because it's to their benefit or they want it to be understood that way. That's the end of it that I see, so that's about all I can speak to from that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I have a question for Ken. Yes. I'm a lifelong Teddy Roosevelt Republican. There aren't very many around anymore.
Yep.
I started voting in '56. I voted for Eisenhower, and except for Kennedy, I voted Republicans all the way through the first Bush's first election. And I'm still annoyed at myself for taking so long to realize what had happened. Can you explain to me what conservatives have done to make this a better country in terms of voting rights, civil rights, clean air, clean water, labor, strong labor conditions to provide, all the things everybody's complaining about? What have conservatives actually done to make this a better country?
So I think you're asking the wrong guy. Because my book's really not a defense of one part or the other. The sort of the notion of, and I'm sure there's another speaker here that is probably best address it. Look, my book is How I Learned to Love the Right, is a play on the Lincoln speech in the Civil War when he talked about the bonds of affection that has to unite the North and the South. And the notion that his notion, which I think is applicable today, that if, in his case, if you could see past the horrible slaughter of the Civil War and see the notion of one community, one country, one people, we need to do that today. Because I think he saw, and I think there's a challenge today, which is the anger from one side or the other was going to kill the nation. It kind of did for 50 years. And I think we're at that same, we're not there, but we're heading down the same place. And the question I had before, the implication, I think, was that the 62 million people on the other side were somehow, who voted for Trump were somehow illegitimate. They did it out of anger or bigotry or hatred or racism. And I think that's the kind of place we're at. And because I think if someone a conservative sitting here sort of asked the question to the other side about liberals, and that's a very dangerous place. And part of the story here is it's not who I met. I mean, I met a lot of people who voted for Trump or considered themselves conservatives because they cared about sort of the sort of loss of social values in the country, the growth of single-parent families, the loss of liberty to government. This is not my story, it's theirs. And the over-entanglement of government. I think there's a lot of stories about why people choose. And I think if we're going to be one country and one people, we need to honor those stories and listen to them and not sort of reject them out of hand. I'm not saying you did, but I think that's really the sort of the nature of this, which is we have a lot to learn from each other. And, I think if you want to answer your question, I think if you want to draw down sort of the Republican leadership of over the years, putting aside our current government, I think there's plenty of people who will stand up and honor it's not my story, but honor the presidency of Ronald Reagan or Dwight Eisenhower or others who I think sort of drove the country in places they think were important at the time.
Thank you so much. Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you all.
For the book signing.
Well done.
Everybody, thank you for coming.
Likewise for you. Excited to read it.